Good evening. I am Kira Foley-Tusman, Chief Administrative Officer of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Library Hour. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League. Guided by the United States Constitution and the history and values of the Union League, the Legacy Foundation's goal is to create more informed, more engaged citizen leaders. We do this through a number of initiatives, civics education programs for students, scholarships, caring for and utilizing the collections, and programs like tonight's Library Hour. All of the work of the Legacy Foundation is made possible through voluntary contributions from Union League members and others who share in our values. My thanks to all of our generous donors who make these programs possible. Tonight's program will run for about an hour. Towards the end of our program, our guests will answer questions from our audience. To submit questions, use the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will get to as many questions as possible. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Jim Mundy, historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation, to introduce tonight's program.
Kira, thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this evening. It's going to be a great program. First and foremost, a little thank you to League member David Denby for introducing us to our speaker, Dr. Gary Vikan. So Dr. Vikan was director of the Walters Art Museum from 1994 to 2013, and from 1985 to 1994, he was the museum's chief curator. And a plug for the Walters: if you haven't been there, you need to get there. It's one of the great museums in the country, and not enough people go to see it. So I couldn't recommend it highly enough. It's a great museum with a great collection. So before coming to Baltimore, Gary was senior associate at Harvard Center for Byzantine Studies at Dumbarton Oaks. A native of Minnesota, he received his Bachelor of Arts from Carleton College and his PhD from Princeton University. Gary serves on the Advisory Council on Culture and the Arts of the Salzburg Global Seminar. He has been an advisor to the Getty Leadership Institute, Princeton University's Department of Art and Archaeology, and the Center for Applied Neuroaesthetics at Johns Hopkins University. Gary was appointed by President Clinton in 1999 to his Cultural Property Advisory Committee and was knighted by the French Minister of Culture in the Order of Arts and Letters in 2002. He is currently the president of the Committee for Cultural Policy and president of the Literary Society of Washington, D.C. In retirement, Gary writes, lectures, and teaches. His recent books include From the Holy Land to Graceland, which must be quite an intellectual leap, and he wrote that in 2012, Sacred and Stolen, Confessions of a Museum Director in 2016, tonight's featured book, The Holy Shroud, A Brilliant Hoax in the Time of the Black Death, and his next book, My Father Took Pictures, will be out shortly in early 2021. Gary and Alana live in Baltimore. They have two daughters, Nicole and Sonia, and two grandchildren. How wonderful. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Gary Vikan.
Thank you, Jim. That was very generous of you. I wish I could be in that wonderful building with you. What I see behind Jim is so tempting. And I did look at the club online today, and I'm in awe of your surroundings. And perhaps someday I can pay you a visit. I certainly hope so. Tonight I'm going to talk about my most recent book. It came out last May. It's about the Shroud of Turin. And while the book came out in 2020, just at the launch of the pandemic, in fact, my fascination with this most famous and most controversial of all Christian relics goes back to when I was a kid in 1981. And I've been trying to figure it out ever since. I think I got pretty close. But I can tell you two things about the Shroud no matter what. It is immensely powerful in a spiritual way, no matter when it was made or why it was made. And two, there is nothing else like it. And if you think of Leonardo da Vinci as the intersection of a brilliant artist and a scientist, the Shroud of Turin is that kind of document. No, Leonardo didn't make it. It precedes him by a bit, but somebody with that kind of extraordinary genius lies behind it. Next slide, please, Jim. There we go. Actually, we'll go to the next one. Next slide, please. There we go. So what I'm talking about is a piece of fine herringbone linen, 14 feet long, just under 4 feet wide. And it shows in very faint sepia tones, imprint front and back of a naked man with long hair, mustache, and beard. And the upper right-hand corner gives you an idea how one might imagine this image, front and back, to have been made. Up the upper left is the Turin Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. And the Shroud of Turin is kept there in a chapel. You can see it behind the church, Baroque chapel, absolutely fantastic little building, in a chapel dedicated solely to the reliquary. The Shroud of Turin comes out every now and then, and when it does, it's seen by 50,000 people a day. This means if it's up for 6 weeks, it's 2.5 million people. It was up in 1978, 1998, the year 2000, 2010, 2015, and it will be displayed again in 2025. Next slide, please. Oh, by the way, before you move on, you can look at it here. If you could imagine the man of the shroud, that male figure, printed front and back on the linen, essentially standing up, he would be pretty big, close to 6 feet tall, 170 pounds. The other thing that would be striking about him, besides the fact that he wears no clothes, is that he seems to be brutally, brutally hurt. The arrow on the right is pointing to what appears to be blood flow from a wrist. The arrow on the left is the back of the figure, and there are upwards to 200 seemingly slicing marks, as if from a whip. So here's a big person, but a big person in death, and a big person whose death seems to have resulted from a brutal, brutal beating. Next slide, Jim. Going the other way. There we go. So what I intend to do is to play a little game, almost. When I became director, I gave up one thing about being a curator that I just loved. And that is those days that were set aside at the Walters and earlier when I was at Dunbar Notes in Washington, D.C., for the general public to come in with something to see if they could stump me. And sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't, sometimes they were fake, sometimes they were genuine works from the ancient and medieval world. But I'm going to pretend as if somebody drove up to my office at the Walters in an SUV, and out of that SUV came this textile. And they put it down before me and said, I'm trying to figure this out. What can you tell me about it? So I'm trying to describe when it was made, where it was made, how it was made, and who is behind it. Whose idea was this? So I'll look at relics, iconography, which is the storytelling through art, visual storytelling, documents, historical documents, because there's some very rich documents describing the Shroud of Turin, and carbon-14 tests. And as you look at the lower right, you can see a bifurcating road. And I will tell my hypothetical visitor with this 14-feet piece of linen that I cannot help him if it's a miracle. I am not in the business of understanding miracles. But I am a historian and an art historian. And I'll do my best to explain this object as it behaves by the rules that I understand, because relics have history, iconography has history, documents are revealing, and they all behave by rules. And what we're looking at the upper right-hand corner there is William of Ockham. And if you're philosophers, you know exactly who he is, and you may have learned the name or even the concept of Occam's razor when you were in college. And the notion is, and this man, by the way, totally coincidentally, it was Franciscan friar from England who ended his days. He died in Munich in 1349, just a few years before the Shroud of Turin appears in history. Anyway, the dictum of Occam was that if you have two potential solutions to the same problem, you're more than likely going to be right if you choose the simplest answer. Lex parsimoniae, the law of succinctness. Next slide, please. So relics, the first thing I'll tell my hypothetical visitors and my audience tonight is that relics were not always part of Christianity. The Gospels do not talk about the crown of thorns, do not talk about the holy wood or the holy nails or any holy textiles. In fact, relics were not part of Christian life until the 4th century. And I think that comes as a surprise to many people. I'm showing on the left here one of the very earliest relics in Christianity, and it's the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. That little building, and if you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That little church-like building at the center of this rotunda has inside it a marble slab. And there are those who believe, millions and millions and millions of Christians believe, that that was the very slab upon which the body of Jesus lay when he came down from the cross. Now, this relic is holy by virtue of having touched the body of Jesus in the eyes of faith. So a relic can be either part of a holy person, or it can be something that the holy person touched. And in this case, the marble slab is believed to have been touched by the body of Jesus. Therefore, it retains the sanctity of Jesus and has the potential, like Jesus, of performing miracles. Well, this relic was hidden under a Roman temple in Jerusalem for more than 3 centuries after the crucifixion. Nobody knew where it was. And the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantine the Great, sent his mother, and she was quite old at the time, St. Helen, to Jerusalem to discover where the tomb of Christ was. And she had a dream, an intuition. And she dug under the temple and she found a tomb. And that tomb is enshrined and is still venerated 17 centuries later. But I'm bringing this to your attention simply because it's one of the very first relics in Christianity. Relics entered the stage of Christian life in the 4th century under the first Christian Roman emperor, Emperor Constantine the Great. So, to the extent that this hypothetical object that I'm trying to define and date is a relic, it's not likely to date before the 4th century because relics just did not exist. But this is a very special kind of relic, and I'm drawing your attention now to the image on the right. You see a king sitting there, and the king has a white textile he's holding in his 2 hands. And on that textile is the face of Jesus. Now, it's a relic by virtue of having touched the body of Jesus, but it's also an icon because it retains the image of Jesus from virtue of that having been touched. So it's both a relic and an icon. And this particular category of object, which the most famous of which is the Veronica veil, the notion that Saint Veronica stepped forward as Christ stumbled on the road to Calvary, and his bloody, sweaty face. And she put a towel against that face, and the towel miraculously retained the facial image of Christ. Well, there are a number of these holy images, icons in Christianity. Our Lady of Guadalupe is one. And this one happens to be one that was in Syria for many centuries. It made its way to Constantinople in the 10th century and ultimately was in Paris in Saint-Chapelle up until the French Revolution, and then it disappeared. But in any event, the king in Syria, who was ill, had heard about a rabbi in Roman Palestine named Jesus, who was performing miracles. So he sent his messenger, that young man in the blue outfit at the left, to Jerusalem and asked Jesus if he would come to Syria, the town of Edessa, and heal him. And Jesus said, in effect, no, I'm too busy with my missionary work and my miracle working here in the Holy Land. But what I will do is wipe my face with this towel, and you can take it back to King Abgar, which was his name, and you will have my image, and he will have the power to heal himself with this relic and icon. So these particular kinds of relics are called images not made by human hands. They're miraculous images. And they appear in Christianity around AD 600. So again, just to reiterate, relics don't exist before roughly 300. Relics with images don't exist before 600. And to the extent the Shroud of Turin is that, it would have to date 600 or later. Next image, please, Jim. What is the moment? What stage in the story of Christ? And we're in Holy Week now, so this is especially meaningful. The Shroud of Turin seems to capture that moment when Jesus has been crucified and he's taken down from the cross. Now, where does that fit in the history of iconography, the history of Christian image making? Well, you may be surprised to learn that there are no images of the crucifixion of Jesus before the 5th century. 400 years went by before anybody dared, literally dared, to show Christ on the cross, like on the ivory at the left there. And look at him. His arms are out, his eyes are open, he doesn't seem to be in any pain. So it's a triumphant crucifixion, almost bloodless. 250 years go by, we left at the right now, the image on the right, you see that the eyes of Jesus are closed and there's some blood. So it's becoming more real and visceral, but he's still on the cross. And you have to go another 400 years and change after roughly 1100 AD, or make it simple, 12th century, before Christ is shown on the ground. And there was good reason for that. Crucifixion was an ultimate act of humiliation. And artists and believers were very uncomfortable speaking about, referencing the fact that Jesus died on the cross in art and came down from the cross as a dead figure. And the very first of them you see at the bottom center. So by that standard, the iconography dating criterion puts this hypothetical image, this new image, the Shroud, in the 12th century or later. Next image, please. And the facial type. You know that we know what Pontius Pilate looked like. We certainly know what Caesar looked like from the coinage. We do not know what Jesus looked like. There's no description of Jesus in the Gospels, and there are no contemporary images of Jesus. In fact, there are no attempts at portraying Jesus before the 4th century. So Jesus is being portrayed in art for the first time about the time that relics enter Christian life. I mean, it's that I think is surprising to many people. And when he first appears, as on the left, he's a young man, beardless, relatively short hair. The face of Christ on the Shroud of Turin is a very different face from the early Christian face. It's what I would call the mature, powerful, somewhat angry looking face of Jesus, as you see on the right from the 12th century. So what I'm saying by this, the way the face of Christ is portrayed matches the iconography of being laid out on the ground dead. Both of them are part of Christian art in the 12th century. Next image, please. So around 1300, we finally arrive at something that looks pretty much like the Shroud of Turin, namely a dead Christ with his hands crossed, crosses lower abdomen, and a textile. And what you see here on the left in red was made in Constantinople shortly after 1300, a textile. And it's a critical part of Christian Orthodox Easter celebration. In fact, it's not used at any time other than Easter time in Orthodoxy. And it's called an epitaphios, which comes from from a Greek word meaning on top of the tomb. So it's the dead Christ and looking very much like the Shroud of Turin. In fact, by seeing these two side by side, you begin to sense how carefully thought out the figure of the man of the shroud is. The way the blood flows down his arm is very, very studied, very artistic, very calculated. But there is one enormous difference between the textile on the left and the textile in negative on the right, between the epitaphios from Constantinople and the Shroud of Turin image of Jesus, and that is blood and gore. The dead Christ on the left is very cleaned up and crisp, whereas the dead Christ on the right is bloody and whipped and painful and wounded, badly wounded. Next slide. So that gets us to blood in art, generally speaking. For the first roughly 12 centuries after Christ, there's very little blood very little of the more visceral aspects of the implications of the crucifixion of Christ. But then in Western Europe, and only in Western Europe, in other words, the world of Orthodoxy, the world of what now is Greek Orthodoxy, the Byzantine world, capital of Constantinople, that world never touched, even got close to the bloodiness, which became so common in Western Europe, showing images of dead Jesus. At the center, you can see the dead Jesus on the lap of his mother. It's from about 1350. So you can almost imagine the composition of the red textile being informed by, being enriched, as it were, enriched by the blood frenzy, as they call it, that was current in Western Europe in the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries. So again, just for the dates, that red textile around 1300, that brutally dead Christ in the lap of his mother at the center around 1350. What I'm saying by that, we're not only getting a sense now of when, we're getting a very strong sense of where. And if I had to come to a conclusion right now, I'd say the Shroud of Turin speaks to, was made in Western Europe in the 14th century. That's when it finds its home. It gets pushed forward to the 14th century. Next slide, please. So we walked forward from the Gospels through relics with images, through iconography of the crucifixion and the lamentation, as it's called, when the body of Jesus is laid out on the ground before the cross, to a textile with an image much like the Shroud, to very bloody images of Jesus. And it gets you into 14th century Western Europe. Now, if you start from today and work your way back into the first appearance of the Shroud in the historical record, the first time it is mentioned, the first time anybody says anything about the existence of the Shroud of Turin, it's in Le Ray, France, and the year is 1355. Le Ray, France, as you can see in that map at the right, is about 100 miles southeast of Paris, just about 10 miles south of the town of Troyes, where the Seine begins. And it's a small town now, fewer than 100 people, and it was a teeny town in the 14th century. And that church you see there in the background was originally wood. It's hardly any larger than the Lutheran church I went to in my little town in Minnesota as a kid, a small church. And there the Shroud of Turin appears for the first time and is offered to pilgrims for veneration. They can come to the church and see it. And on the left is the little souvenir they get when they see it. And you can see, if you look very carefully, there's a kind of reproduction in lead, these extra pewter little things. It's probably about 2.5 inches wide. And you can see a dead figure front and back, much like the Shroud. You can get a little hint of the herringbone pattern of the textile. And while you can't see exactly what's holding up this Shroud that is being offered for veneration, there are two figures. Their heads are broken off, but their ecclesiastical garb is very clear. They have stolas on, they're crossed across their neck. So in other words, this little lead pilgrim souvenir is being given out to those people. And by the way, this little church is very near the Roman road. And almost certainly it was being offered for veneration around the time of the summer festival, which actually took place in the last week in June, where people would come from all over Europe to Troyes to exchange goods. And then all of a sudden they're learning that in this little church just south of town on the Roman road, hardly a half a day's walk, maybe 2 hours walk, 3 hours walk, they can look at a textile which the people in the church are saying is the true burial shroud of Jesus. Not only that, the people in the church are saying that miracles are being performed by this textile. So people come down, they give their offerings, they actually give money to the church. They get these little souvenirs, they pay for them, and away they go. And it seems that the first epiphany, the first offering of the Shroud of Turin for veneration in 1355 It was a big hit. That huge numbers of people were coming to see it. It caused a huge sensation. And its owner was pretty important. Next slide, please. That little church was built by the most famous knight of the Middle Ages. His name was Shroud de Charnay. And you see him in the battle. By the way, as you may know, the 100 Years' War now, about 2 decades old into the 100 Years' War, and France is losing miserably. Shroud de Charnay is the leading knight of the French Middle Ages. He wrote the book of chivalry, the guide to knightly behavior, that became a standard work for every knight after that. He was given the oriflamme, the battle standard of the king. In fact, King John II of France went into battle at Poitiers with Shroud de Charnay holding the oriflamme by his side. The king was captured, but he didn't lose his life. Why? Because Shroud de Charnay saved his life, but in the meantime was killed in 1356, the low point for the French of the 100 Years' War. Anyway, you can see his coat of arms, the 3 shields, silver shields against a red background. And where the red arrow is on the left-hand side, you can see that same coat of arms. The second coat of arms are those of his wife. So what I'm telling you is, Shroud de Charnay built this church. It had a dean and 6 canons. So there were 7 clerics in this church that he built. He built it in 1353, 3 years before he died. And the sole purpose of this church was to have those 7 clerics pray for him, his soul, and the soul of all of his family. 24/7, 365. It was a collegiate church and had no parish. Yeah, all it had was one mission, and that is to ensure the salvation of the soul of Geoffroy and his family. And so it needed money. You know, you had 7 people to support and a church to build. And the king was very fond of Geoffroy. That's why he gave him the battle standard. And that's why he asked him to write the book of chivalry. And so the king would give land grants to the knight, and the land grants would generate taxes, and that would help pay for the church. And in addition to that, somebody important gave him this textile because they knew the textile would be an object of pilgrimage, devotion, and gifts. So that too would help to sustain the church in perpetuity, and by sustaining the church, to sustain and ensure the salvation of the soul of the founder of the church, Geoffroy de Charnay. Well, that irritated the Bishop of Troyes immensely. Was he jealous? Almost certainly. But he was really angry that thousands of people, probably tens of thousands of people, were going to this little wooden church 10 miles south of town, bypassing his cathedral, which was a wreck. He needed all the money he could get to finish the tower of his cathedral. And by the way, the roof collapsed. So he was seeing all the pilgrims with all of their offerings going down to this little wooden church 10 miles south of town, and he was immensely irritated. And so he swooped in because he was going to take this textile away from the church. His rationale for this, what he said he was doing, was to stop the lying, because he said people were faking miracles, that the people in this little church were faking miracles, that they were calling this the true shroud of Jesus, when in fact they knew it wasn't the true shroud of Jesus. They knew it was an object of recent manufacture, so that they were lying both by what they said it could do and by how old they said it was. They said it was the true shroud of Jesus. So the bishop decided he would swoop in and take it, but before he could get it, it was spirited out of town by Geoffroy's wife, surviving wife. And it disappeared for 34 years. And nobody knows exactly where it was, but she married again, and it likely went with her. And she had a son called Geoffroy II. Next slide, please. So while this is all happening, to get a sense of what was going on in Europe, As I say, the Shroud of Turin first appears in 1355. That's 7 years after the onslaught of the Black Death. The Black Death arrived in Europe in the fall of 1347 by way of Messina in Sicily, and it spread north. In 7 months, 1/3 of the population of Europe was dead. In multiple iterations of the Black Death, over a period of 50 years, half of the population of Europe died. So we think that we have trouble with the pandemic, COVID-19. But in fact, if it was as deadly as the Black Death, more than 100 million Americans would have perished by now. So it was hugely disruptive. On the left-hand screen, you can see somebody being buried. And by the way, it attacked the lymph nodes and it killed within 2 days. And there were 2 versions of it. One you got from rats and one you got from somebody already sick by coughing on you. If you were exposed to rats, you had a 30% chance of dying. If you were exposed to somebody who was already sick, you had a 90% chance of dying. And nobody knew how it was transmitted. They even believed you could get sick by looking at somebody who was sick. And so it generated some very bizarre religious behavior, the strangest of which are people who went from town to town, and we're looking at them on the right here, from town to town, bearing their backs and whipping themselves as a way of absolving themselves of the sin which must be driving the death that God has visited on the world. So they would go from town to town, whipping themselves brutally with a cat of nine tails, and they would collapse. And some of them even died by the brutality of their self-mortification. And they were called flagellants. They went from town to town, just whipping themselves. They were outside the boundary of the church. In fact, the Pope made them illegal eventually because their behavior was so fanatical. But what you see at the bottom center is a tomb of somebody who died of the Black Death. So what I'm saying by this is when the Shroud of Turin appears in the historical record for the first time, it comes right on the heels of the most brutal pandemic in the history of the world. And people are dying in droves. They cut these enormous trenches in churchyards, but dogs would carry the corpse out at night. So in Avignon, where the Pope then lived, the Pope didn't live in Rome in those days. The Pope was in southern France in the town of Avignon. And it got so bad, so many people were dying that they'd throw the bodies into the Rhone River and they'd be carried out to the Mediterranean. And the Pope blessed the river so that the bodies were in a way sanctified by being tossed into the river and being carried away. But if you can imagine 11,000 people dying in just a matter of days in a town that didn't have more than 30,000 people to begin with. So it was a brutal, brutal time. The Black Death is when it appeared, and people whipping themselves. And you look back at the shroud and you think to yourself, well, that image of Jesus on the shroud bears something like 200 marks seemingly of whipping. So in a way, if you're sick or fearful and you look at that shroud image, the empathic power must have been enormous. Next slide, please. So what did the Pope do? Well, in the year 1300, the Pope decided that there should be a jubilee once every century, a jubilee year on the millennium going forward. So there was one in 1300, and that meant people went to Rome and they were given all kinds of blessings for having made this trip to Rome. And by the way, what you're looking on the left here, St. Peter's before Michelangelo and his friends redid it. This is what St. Peter's looked like in the medieval period. And realize that Rome, the population of Rome was probably under 50,000. In fact, way under 50,000. And yet, at this time of year precisely, around Easter, upward to 1 million people would visit Rome. And they all went to St. Peter's, and they would all be shown an image of the face of Christ. And that image of the face of Christ is the Veronica veil. And you see it at the bottom center in a little lead pilgrim badge that they would sew under their hats. And it shows Saint Veronica holding the textile up with the face of Jesus, which is much like like what King Abgar had, which I showed earlier. So they would go to the Vatican and go to St. Peter's, and you can see them at the right there. Hundreds of thousands of people would be kneeling before that sacred face. And so this was in 1350. And you can imagine, in a world where death was ever present, it came quickly within a matter of 2 or 3 days, and people were mystified as to what caused it. They thought it was the alignment of 3 planets, or miasma in the air, or perhaps Jews had poisoned wells. But they didn't know what to make of what was going on. They were deathly afraid. And so the Pope decided there should be a Jubilee year, 50 years instead of 100 years after the first one. So there was a Jubilee year in 1350. So you can imagine the temptation, how attractive it would be to have in France an image of Christ that was as powerful and compelling as the one in the Vatican. Next slide, please. So finally, the bishop, after 34 years went by, and the shroud, who knows where it was? I think it apparently was taken away to Switzerland. And then it came back, not with, obviously not with Geoffroy de Charnay, but with his son, Geoffroy II, and his widow. Somehow brought it back to that little church in Relics in France and re-exhibited it. It's now 1389. And again, hordes of people are coming to see it and giving offerings. And again, the bishop, a successor bishop in Troyes, just 10 miles away, is very upset. I think he wants it, but his rationale to the Pope in Avignon, Pope Clement VII, was that people are being deceived. It's not really the burial cloth of Jesus, but they're being told that it is, that miracles are being faked, that lies are being spread, that people are being deceived. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And the Bishop of Troyes wants it seized and taken to Troyes. Obviously, it would be good for him because he never finished his church. On the upper left there, you can see it doesn't have its south tower. So he would have done well to have the income that the Shroud would have generated were it coming his way. But the Pope finally decided in January of 1390, Pope Clement VII, the anti-pope, because now there's a pope in Avignon in France, and there's one in Rome. And the French are paying more attention to the one in their own country than in Italy. So finally, the Pope steps in and said, time out, folks. You can keep that shroud. You can keep that textile in Relics. Fine, you can show it. But when you do, you must have somebody stationed right near it. You can imagine what this would be like. To say in a loud and clear voice, and this is a quote, "It is not the true shroud of our Lord Jesus Christ, but is a figure or representation of the shroud that is said to have been that of our Lord Jesus Christ." So what the Pope is saying to the people in the little town of Relics, in other words, these 7 clerics, the dean and the 6 canons, yes, you can show this textile, but there are 2 conditions. You have to be very clear that this is a figure or representation of what some people believe to be the shroud, but it is not the true shroud of Jesus, which may never have existed. And by the way, it can't be treated as a relic. And in those days, the protocol for relics was very precise. What candles and torches would be lit, what kind of stand they could put on, what the ecclesiastics, what these 7 ecclesiastics in that little church in there, hey, remember it's made of wood, what they could dress like. And the Pope said, you're not supposed to get dressed in finest regalia. You're not supposed to light torches. You're not supposed to have a special stand. He would let them show it, but they have to be clear that this is a figure or representation of the shroud of Christ, or at least what some people believe is a shroud of Christ. But obviously, it is not the true shroud. And that is the last that the Pope had anything to say in a kind of papal juridical way about the Shroud of Turin. That's in 1390. Next slide. So now Benedict the 16th and more recently Francis the First are very careful to use the word icon, which is image, mirror, they sometimes call it a mirror, but they never call it the actual relic of Christ. And by avoiding the word relic, they are being very careful not to imply, not to claim, not to say that this textile, from the point of view of the Vatican, ever touched the body of Jesus. Carbon-14 dating, oops. Carbon-14 dating, when it did happen, very clear. The textile itself, oops, next one, there we go. The linen of the textile of the Shroud of Turin was harvested sometime between 1260 and 1390. In other words, the midpoint is 1325, which happens to be what, 30 years before the Shroud appears in the historical record. Front page of the New York Times, October 1988. Church says Shroud of Turin isn't authentic. You'd think that might be the end of it. Next slide, please. But nobody could figure out how it was made. And as I say, I started on the Shroud in 1981, and only fairly recently, thanks to a brilliant man in Texas, did I finally figure out how it was made. And it's made with the constituent ingredients of iron gall ink, one of which is tannic acid, which comes from gall nuts, which grow on trees, on oak trees. And his name is Bob Morton, by the way, who figured this out. And the other ingredient is iron sulfate. Next slide, please. And when the two are separated, one is a kind of milky greenish color, and one is a sort of a beige color. But when they're combined, they turn deep jet black. And that is the stuff of medieval ink. In fact, it's the stuff of ink all the way from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Declaration of Independence. And it's a great ink, but it will rust and fade because it is an iron sulfate, unless it's sealed with tree sap. So the Shroud of Turin is nothing more or less than the same material that's used to write the Gospels, except it doesn't have the tree sap in it to seal it. So over time, it gradually rusted away. And that's why it looks so faint the way it does. Next slide, please. So Bob Morton, the man who figured this out in his compound in Texas, did some experiments himself. That's his wife. What did they amount to? In the simplest form, lather her up with tannic acid, which he made from tea, actually, which you can do. And then put iron sulfate on the textile, put the two together, and they will develop into a print. Next slide, please. And there he is, James Johnson, printed on the left and a negative on the right. Now, there's much more detail that is conveyed to the textile through a contact print based on the intersection of tannic acid, iron sulfate, the two ingredients in iron gall ink, than there is in any photograph. You get much more specific detail. And Bob Morton went to great lengths to approximate exactly how the shroud was made. And it takes a lot of practice because if you wrap the textile around the head, it will totally distort it. But he finally did figure out how it was made, and everything about the shroud, as it's scientifically analyzed, conforms to his experiment. And so that was a huge final step in the storyline. Next slide. So the final question, where did the shroud come from? Now, we know who its first owner was. It was Geoffroy de Charnay, but he didn't make it himself. It certainly wasn't made in that little town of Verrey, nor in Troyes for that matter. It almost certainly came from Avignon or it came from Paris. If it came from Avignon, it was Pope Clement VI, the man who had built the great palace of the Pope in Avignon. If it came from Paris, it would be King John the Good, who, by the way, was the one who survived the Battle of Poitiers, thanks to Geoffroy de Charnay. Which is the more likely of the two? I think almost certainly Avignon. And the reason for that is Pope Clement VI, next slide, please, hired all kinds of Italian artists to work to decorate his palace. And if you visited there, you know that some remnants of the great frescoes that Simone Martini, one of the great Sienese masters of the 14th century, created are still to be seen on the walls of the church, of that palace, I should say. So my conclusion for my book is simply that Pope Clement VI was behind it, that the artist was somebody as brilliant as Leonardo da Vinci, but preceded him by 150 years. That if it wasn't Simone Martini himself, it would have been one of his students. Simone Martini is on the left, and on the right, flanking the negative image of the shroud, is one of his students, Nardo Ciccarelli. So with that, I will open the floor. Next slide, please. The end. And welcome questions, thoughts, responses. Thank you.
All right, Gary. All right. Our first question is, what is the one question that still haunts you regarding the shroud?
What is the what?
What is the one question that still haunts you regarding the shroud?
Well, it's the question of why it is so powerful, why it works such incredible power over people. And many of the people that believe that they are looking at the face of Christ when they see the face of the man of the shroud will describe their first encounter as a kind of epiphany, as if they somehow had a realization or a recognition of something profound, which may have drawn them into years of study of the shroud, simply because when they saw it the first time, they were convinced that they saw the face of Jesus. And I think understanding how that very elusive image can have that power. In my heart of hearts, I don't think when this image was made in the Papal Palace in Avignon, 1352 or 1353, I don't think the Pope or his artists, his Italian artists, the people that were working for him in the Papal Palace, I don't think they had any evil intent. I really do not. I think they wanted to give Geoffroy de Charnay, who they knew very well and admired greatly, they wanted to give him a revenue source for his church. He needed the money to pay his 7 clerics. And so they made this image, but whoever the artist was at the intersection of science and art the way Leonardo was, 150 years later. And he never made a second one. There is no second. So did he intend that it would fool people? Did he intend that it would be a lie? It's not a lie. It was made to be a devotional image, just like a regular icon, just like a panel painting. But because it's so vague, because it's so amorphous, it's so cloud-like, and so hard to see, that people of faith inform it with a kind of potency, a kind of spiritual power that is enormous. And I puzzle in my book over that. I think no matter what the Pope said in 1390, his idea was that somebody in authority of the church would stand next to the display of the shroud in l'Épée, okay? And they would say in a loud and clear voice, this is a figure or representation of what some people think was the burial cloth of Jesus. No matter what they said, the image itself is so mysterious, so unusual, unique, that I think it's inevitable that it would have the power that it has and will continue to have. The Catholic Church does not call it a relic. They're very careful. They call it an image, an icon, a mirror, but they don't call it a relic because they know it's not a relic. And what was so interesting to me, and it took me forever to figure this out, when this object appears in this little town in France in the mid-1350s, the plague has just come and gone. It'll come back, but it's come and gone. A third of the people in France are dead. Everything is in uproar. Their agrarian system is totally collapsed because too many farmers have died. The church has collapsed because the priests who were ministering to the sick all died. So it was just chaos when this thing appeared. And I think the power it has is the power of its own ambiguity. And nobody at the time, whether they were trying to defend it against what the bishops were saying about it, or even the bishops as they attacked it, nobody tried to explain how it ever got to this little town in France. 13 centuries after the crucifixion. All relics have stories. Every relic that I know of any significance has a story that explains how it came to be, especially if it comes from the Holy Land and ended up in northern Spain, like the relics of St. James. Mm-hmm. So there are legends that explain all that. There is no legend of the Shroud of Turin. Why? Because the people knew it was of recent manufacture. But even knowing that didn't make any difference, because then as now, it is a powerful, powerful, powerful image. It's amazing.
It is indeed. All right, so next question. How did the shroud get to Turin and come to be referred to as the Shroud of Turin?
Well, it's been there since later 16th century. And by the way, the other thing that might strike you as odd, until 1983, the Shroud of Turin was in private hands. It belonged to the House of Savoy. And it had belonged to the House of Savoy from the 15th century. So in other words, the most famous relic in Christianity was privately owned until the last king of Italy, Alberto III, I guess his name was, died in 1983, and he gave it to the Vatican. And the Vatican said, well, we'll leave it in Turin, which was the home city of the House of Savoy. So it wandered around a bit, but finally ended up in Turin in the 16th century, and it's been there, as I say, ever since.
Okay. All right. Well, first off, our next question or questioner says, thank you for the interesting presentation to begin with. And I think we all think that. But it says, I had the opportunity to visit the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Is there any question to the authenticity of that relic?
Well, what's interesting is, I told you the story of St. Helen in a fairly advanced age, arriving in Jerusalem and having a vision, a kind of spiritual experience that tells her under this Roman temple, you will find a tomb, and that is the tomb of Jesus. So since she's the mother of the king, she can do what she wants. So she has the temple taken down and they start digging. And yes, sure enough, they discover in the landfill beneath the temple, a tomb, a Roman tomb. And Jerusalem's old Jerusalem is a pretty small town. And that is in the area of Jewish tombs of the time of Christ. And so quite possibly she found the very tomb in which the body of Jesus lay. That is quite possible. And it's been a place of veneration since the early 4th century, continuously. Okay.
Well, that's it for our questions. And I studied medieval history in college, and to me, it's still a fascinating period of history, especially when it comes to the church. And it's both religious and political role during the Middle Ages and the need for money and things like that. So it's still a great story. So I wish we could go on for another hour. So I think this would be a great presentation. Even a longer presentation would be great. So Doctor, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It was absolutely fantastic. Boy. And I hope everybody gets to watch it a second time on the Legacy Foundation's YouTube page or a Facebook page and YouTube. It'll be available for quite a while to come. And if you really want to say thank you to Dr. Vikan, go out and buy his books.
That'd be nice.
That would, yeah.
It's
that always helps.
Sell books during the plague, I can tell you that.
No. And one of the I guess the victims of the current plague is that without in-person programming, authors don't get to actually sell their books and sign their books to an audience, which is really kind of a shame. So, and League members are good book buyers. So let me encourage all the League members to go out and buy these books. I mean, and they all sounded fascinating. So, and there's one coming out shortly as well. So if you want to say thank you to Dr. Vikan, go buy a book. Gary, thank you very much. Really, that was just fantastic. Anyway, so, all right, folks, and thank you all for watching this evening. And just to go over the next program schedule, we have a Liberty Series program on April the 15th. Will feature Jason Riley, a member of the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal, who will talk about racism, politics, and economics. That will be followed by a Civil War Roundtable on Wednesday, April the 21st. It's going to be the third Wednesday of the month, not the fourth Wednesday this month. All right. So on the 21st, we will have local wonderful musician named Charlie Zom give a musical program on the March of the Cameron Men. So as you can imagine, it'll be Scottish and Civil War music. Okay. So, and then May 13th, we have our next library hour, and it will feature Cordelia Biddle, who is a Philadelphian and a lifelong Philadelphian, and she wrote a book about her ancestor, Nicholas Biddle, called Nicholas Biddle, Unlikely Populist. So those are our programs coming up, and they all 3 different kinds of programs, but I'm sure they're all going to be fantastic. So again, thank you everybody for watching. Gary, thank you again. It was just like I say, I wish it could go on and on and on, because I live in the Middle Ages. So although I'm in the wrong place for that right now. So, but anyway, so everybody, we appreciate your support, and a shout out to the Union League Legacy Foundation for making sure that we have programming, whether it's in person or virtually. So, and with that, go out, get your vaccine, stay safe, and stay well. So folks, thank you all for joining us this evening, and goodbye now.